Hi, everybody. Today is Sunday, September 21st, 2025, and our friend and Professor Marandi is back with us. Welcome back, Professor.
Hi, Nima. Thank you very much for having me on your show. It's a great pleasure.
Let's start. Please subscribe and hit the like button to help us reaching more people. And let me start with what has happened. Iran tried to do everything at its disposal to talk with IAEA, to talk with Europeans. But Europeans have decided to go after snapback sanctions. It seems that it would be their decision going to be to come back with the new sanctions to try to maximum pressure as they were talking about it during in before JCPOA happening. What is right now in the mind of Iranian officials? How is Iran going to deal with this current situation?
There's a misunderstanding about the decision making process in Iran that I see is very much at play online and among people of influence. And that is that they assume that a particular person, if he says something in Iran, that is representative of the views of the political establishment. Or if they see that a senior figure says a sentence or a few sentences on a particular occasion, that reflects that person's views in general. And I think that's very much mistaken. The Iranians, in my opinion, those who are in charge, they knew quite well that the Europeans will use the snapback mechanism. There are those in Iran who would like to extend the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and have the Europeans not use this mechanism for now, and to kick the can down the road. And there are those who are saying, let's just get it over with and say that we are going to halt cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency and come what may. But I think what the political establishment has done, meaning the Supreme National Security Council, what they have done is they've taken a third route. And that is that they knew quite well that there will be no nuclear deal and that the Europeans are going to leave the deal. And that is under pressure from Netanyahu, their Zionist overlords, and the United States and their Zionist overlords. So it was inevitable. But the Iranians wanted the price for this escalation to be on the shoulders of the Europeans and not on the Iranians. So what they did was that they agreed to sit down with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and ultimately they reached an agreement which they signed in Cairo or in Egypt. But they did this knowing that it was almost for certain that despite that agreement, the Europeans and the British would go to the UN Security Council. What is the benefit of doing this? As I said, it puts Iran politically in a much better position. It can tell allies, it can tell friends, it can tell its own people that, look, these people are not reasonable. Despite the fact that the Iranians are very angry with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they believe that they colluded with the Israeli regime and that the head of the agency intentionally assisted the Israeli regime by putting out false statements so that they could use it to attack Iran. Despite that, this government made that agreement. But the government knew that the Europeans would still go to the UN Security Council. So I think that was a smart move. But some people, I think, have a bit of it, they're a bit impatient. Iran is very patient. Iran has been very patient in the past, and it will continue to be very patient. Another example, over the last few days, I'm sure you heard that Iran at the UN, at the International Atomic Energy Agency, wanted to put a resolution to vote. And then the Americans put pressure, and the Iranians withdrew that resolution. The Western media said that Iran backed down in the face of American pressure, and a lot of people thought that was humiliating. But that's not what happened. The Americans didn't put pressure on Iran. The Americans put pressure on countries to vote against Iran. And many of these countries, they are vulnerable. They're not, look at our own region. The only country in the region that stands up to the United States is Iran. It's not anyone but Iran. In the whole of West and Central and Southern Asia, it's just Iran and Yemen and North Africa. It's just Iran and Yemen. So many of these nations were being bullied by the United States to vote against this resolution. The Iranians withdrew it, A, because they didn't want their resolution to be rejected, even though those countries supported Iran, but if they voted against Iran, it wouldn't have looked good. And also they wanted those countries that would have probably voted against Iran to be thankful to Iran for getting them out of this difficult situation. If Iran, someone could say, no, you should have put it to the vote and to a vote and have these countries humiliated. Yes, you can do many things, but you are fighting a long war with the Zionist establishment that controls the West and our region to a large degree. And you're very much alone. You need to pick your fights carefully. You need to maneuver carefully. And you need to be more wise and more courageous, but more wise and more careful in how you carry out war. So a lot of what we see now is based on emotions. People get angry, emotional. Or some people say, for example, why doesn't Iran continue striking the Israeli regime? They want Iran to fire more missiles at the regime. Yes, I understand that. People across the world see Iran as the only hope. And Iran is the only hope. Iran is helping Yemen. Iran is helping Gaza in ways that we will know decades from now. Iran is helping Lebanon. Iran is helping the resistance across the region. And that is the reason why the Israeli regime is drowning. It is despised across the world today. But when Iran fought back against the Israeli regime, despite the hit that it took on day one, yes, it came out on top. True. And as Steve Bannon pointed out, Trump came to the rescue of Netanyahu to get that ceasefire. And the Iranians, of course, did not agree for a number of days. They continued to hammer until 12 days. They continued to hammer the Israeli regime until Iran, after getting certain concessions, halted firing the missiles. Could Iran have continued for a few more days? Yes, it could have. However, the Iranians are not childish. They're not emotional. They know that there's a balance of power in this region. If Iran fights the Israeli regime in a way in which In war, you get hit and you hit. Israel will be hammered, Iran will be hit too. Neighboring regimes could take advantage of that. We know that the Republic of Azerbaijan is an ally of the Israeli regime. We know that the Americans and the Israelis are very influential in Iraqi Kurdistan. We know that Turkey is not a friend of the axis of resistance. They've been working alongside the Israeli regime to undermine it across the region. They were supporting the Saudis when the Saudis carried out the genocidal war against Yemen for 7 years. They only broke away in Qatar when Qatar was besieged by the Saudis and the Emiratis. So Iran has to be strong against NATO, against the United States, against the Israeli regime and its allies. So it has to fight and remain powerful. It has to push forward politically, but prevent the Americans from isolating it. So Iran does what it needs to do to keep as many people on its side. It does what it can do to hammer the Israeli regime without weakening its defenses, because true public opinion is on our side. The global resistance shares the views of the axis of resistance. But the reality on the ground is that Erdogan is a member of NATO. Aliyev is a close ally of the Israeli regime. They are exporting oil to the Israeli regime as it carries out genocide. The Kurdish areas of Iraq are not under the proper control of the Iraqi central government. There are thousands of terrorists that are being harbored there. You have huge US influence there. And where did the drones come from, by the way? You know that there were no Israeli aircraft over Iranian airspace during the 12-day war. These were drones and missiles that came in. Where did the drones come from? We've heard a lot about the Republic of Azerbaijan. We heard a lot about northern Iraq and Syria. So Iran has to be very calculating. It has to continue confronting the Israeli regime and its allies. And the Israelis have been paying a price. Now, the West can say all they want about the Israelis having the upper hand and the resistance being weakened. But what we're seeing today is an Israeli regime that's despised across the world. I mean, let's just go to Charlie Kirk's death. People don't believe the FBI narrative. The story doesn't add up. And people are accusing Israel. I don't know who did it. I have no idea. I think the Israelis have an interest in it from what we're hearing about how he changed and so on. But the point is that the Israeli regime is so deeply despised in the United States that Netanyahu has to constantly go and tweet and put out videos saying that we didn't do it. This means that the situation for the regime is horrific. It's terrible. Now, the economy, the military, all that aside, the Israeli regime has lost its aura of legitimacy. It is seen as something worse than the Nazi regime to ordinary Europeans and North Americans. How do you calculate that? Western media is never going to tell the truth. But the reality is that the axis of resistance and the growing global resistance are killing the Israeli regime with 1,000 cuts. The objective is not to steamroll the regime. The objective is to delegitimize it, to expose it, to weaken it, or to ultimately at some point fall apart. And I think that a lot has been achieved during this period. So basically, the way Iran functions is very different from what some of our sympathetic friends online are saying. This is not a sellout. The agreement in Egypt was an agreement that Iran knew would not last. Iran, when it withdrew the resolution at the IAEA, It knew that it probably, despite the fact that most members, all non-Western members, except for one or two, would have voted for Iran, but they saw what the threats that the Americans were putting out. You know that the Americans are, the U.S. and the Europeans are crazy now. Their behavior is outrageous, making threats every day. Trump on Truth Social within hours threatens Afghanistan and Venezuela, and he's always threatening everyone nowadays. So when Iran withdrew it, there was a reason for it. It was not because Iran was under American pressure. So I think that it's pretty clear that what we have now is a situation where we will have the snapback mechanism carried out, and the UN resolutions will be reinstated. But they will have a psychological impact, and they're having a psychological impact on the Iranian market. But the reality is that they will not have a big impact on the Iranian economy, because there are not going to be any new sanctions. These are all of those sanctions that exist in these UN resolutions are already in place. They're being implemented by the Europeans and Americans. They're part of the maximum pressure sanctions, and the maximum pressure sanctions go far, far, far beyond the UN sanctions. So the UN sanctions are basically sanctions that are already in place, and far more than those sanctions are already being implemented. Now, the question may be for some is, why do we have UN sanctions? At that time, when the United States was able to put these sanctions in place, Russia and China were much weaker countries, and the United States was much stronger, and so were the Europeans to a degree. But the Russians and the Chinese being much weaker than now, what they basically were able to do was to water down the texts of the resolutions, but they could not block it back then, or they felt that they couldn't block it. Of course, Iran's expectations were that they would block them. But in any case, they watered them down. But back then, things were different. But now we saw that in China, during the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, the Iranian foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister, and the Chinese foreign minister signed a very important declaration, which your viewers should look up. And that is a statement where they say that the snapback is not legitimate, and what the Europeans did is not legal, and therefore they do not recognize it. So this is an important point, because that basically means that the Russians and the Chinese will ignore this, the so-called revival of the UN Security Council resolutions. And the UN is already falling; it's already dying. But this, I think, is a very important statement that the three foreign ministers signed, and quite an achievement, by the way, as well.
Uh, I think the situation with the JCPOA and the sanctions before that is important because of the role of China and Russia, not only because of their position that was weaker in those days, but we didn't have that sort of confrontation in those days between the West, particularly the United States and Russia and China, tariff war as is happening as we talk between the United States and China. The war in Ukraine has totally changed the geopolitical issues of the region in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia. And how is that going? What's your assessment of the pressure that they can bring to Iran? We know that they're talking about it's going to be on September 27th, the snapback sanction, the date of the sanctions coming back on Iran.
Yeah, I think that's right. Basically, well, we have a situation now, and you're absolutely correct. Not only is China and Russia, not only are they much stronger today than they were back then, and continue to grow stronger in relative terms compared to the West, But also, as you rightly pointed out, the confrontation that existed back then was much smaller, much more limited, and nothing like what we have today between the West and these countries, and other countries as well. But I'm speaking about Russia and China because they are in the UN Security Council and they have the right of veto. So you're absolutely correct. We are living in a very different world today. In fact, as you know, I returned from China just this morning, and in conversations with influential people in China, uh, I saw that the Chinese the worldview of those who I spoke with was very much in line with what we're speaking about today. And one of these people who I spoke with, said basically that, and I didn't expect him to say it because our Chinese friends are sometimes very cautious. They're usually very cautious, but he said that uh, Iran, Russia, and China, and he wasn't some person who's in the media or anything like that. But I don't want to go into any further. But he was saying that it is Iranian strength is Chinese strength, Russian strength is Chinese strength, Chinese strength is Iranian and Russian strength. Right now, all have to remain strong. And it may sound very normal uh, for your audience to hear, but this was a person of influence who usually doesn't speak that way. Or at least I haven't seen that person speak that way before. But in any case, the point is that the world has indeed changed, and the the Americans continue to, meanwhile, isolate themselves, which I think is all working well for Iran. I mean, look at what they're doing to India. Not just recently, they uh, reimposed the sanctions for Chabahar in Iran, so that India will not be able to continue investment in Chabahar. Why? Because they want to block the north-south corridor. They wanted to discontinue functioning in order to hurt India, Russia, and Iran. And then we saw the visa fees that were just imposed that basically targeted India more than anyone else. A very distant second comes the Chinese. But what it does in any case is that it marginalizes India further. And then we saw, of course, the strike on Qatar, which we've discussed before. That has further isolated the United States. It's led an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan to be made public. Uh, and it just shows that countries, now, regardless of the nature of that agreement and what implications it may have, but the point is that it forces Arab family regimes in the Persian Gulf to rethink their situation. They're very vulnerable. The country that they thought was protecting them, and they were paying such a huge cost for it, trillions of dollars, literally, in bribes over the years, that regime was against them. That regime facilitated the attack and allowed Qatar to be targeted, even though Qatar is probably the most obedient of all the countries in the Persian Gulf region. And the only reason why Hamas existed there is because the United States and the Israeli regime wanted them there. And Western leaders benefit from Qatar enormously, financially speaking, individuals, including the Israeli regime, because Qatar, as well as other countries, they give money to people of influence, and they invested in places such as Israel and in Palestine. So these countries feel very vulnerable. And then the regular strikes on Syria and the strikes on Turkish assets in Syria are a threat to Turkey. So the West is basically doing its best to isolate itself. And what the Europeans, by the way, Nima, have done to Iran is that, and I tweeted this a few days ago when it was clear that they were going to implement the snapback, or the trigger the snapback, is that they've isolated themselves permanently. they've burnt down the bridges with Russia and China. So they no longer have cheap energy from Russia anymore. And now they burnt their bridges with Iran. The only reason why the Iranians engaged with the Europeans was because of the JCPOA. Now the Europeans have no special status anymore. We don't do any trade with them of, of significance. We've moved to the east. We've moved to the south. We've moved to BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization member states. We live in a very different world now. The Europeans' only advantage that they had was that the JCPOA was an excuse for them to remain engaged with Iran. Well, they're not going to have that anymore. So they've lost the opportunity to have Iranian oil and gas replace Russian oil and gas. They needed it. They no longer will have Russian oil and gas in future either, because the Russians have now promised it to China, Siberia 2. The gas from Siberia 2 is the gas that was going to Europe. So that's it. Someone somewhere wrote that the century of humiliation for Europe is possibly about to begin. I think it was Politico, the Politico in Europe, which I think is quite possible. I think it's I don't know if it will be a century, but it will be a very, very long time. And the Europeans are going to suffer the consequences of their policies. So, in my opinion, in the long run, the Iranians no longer need to. I mean, they have no leverage against Iran anymore. They've given up their last bit of leverage, and so Iran can uh, focus on new relationships. And of course, Iran no longer will be cooperating with the International Atomic Energy Agency. But I think that's good news for Iran.
You mean that Iran would withdraw from NPT? And what's going on, and how is Iran going to respond to the measures on the part of the United States and Europeans?
I don't know what they will do. Obviously, this agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency that was signed in Egypt is now null and void. Whether Iran will leave the NPT or whether it will suspend cooperation with NPT, I don't know. But it doesn't matter. Iran can now move. Well, I mean, it does matter. There is a difference between the different policies. Um, I'm not sure Iran may leave the NPT. I don't know. I'm not sure if it will, but I think Iran will take certain steps. It may go all the way and leave. It may suspend its membership. I don't know. But what it does is that it leaves Iran's hands untied. And we do know that the general that ran the U.S. intelligence agency admitted that the Iranian nuclear program was not destroyed. Iran has the infrastructure to build uh, centrifuges and everything else that it needs. And the program itself, from what he says, I'm not saying it, was not destroyed. That puts Iran in a very commanding position. And of course, Iran's missile capabilities are second to none. We've seen how Iranian missiles drove Netanyahu to Trump to get a ceasefire. We saw how they rained down on Tel Aviv and other cities. We saw how the collective West was unable to stop those missiles. So Iran has nuclear technology. It now has no reason to show what it's doing to the West. It has its missile capabilities, and the Iranians, although we have a fatwa, which is obviously very important for us, but Iran has already said on multiple occasions, both the current head of the Supreme National Security Council, before he was the head of the council, but also a Dr. Kharazi, an advisor to the leader in foreign policy. Both these gentlemen said um, before, Mr. Kharazi on more than one occasion, that Iran's nuclear posture could change if there's an existential threat to the country, which is the moral position to take. The moral position to take is not to have a nuclear weapon because it's a horrible weapon and because it causes problems across the region. But if there's an existential threat to the people, in order to prevent anything horrific from happening to the people, then Iran would change its nuclear posture. In other words, to protect the people. So we'll have to see what happens. But I think that the Americans have been stupid. Trump has been very foolish, as usual. He strengthened Iran's hand. And the Americans have lots of problems. They've not only have they created this huge uh, huge number of adversaries across the world. Remember, in 2000 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, Iran was the great force of evil for the West. Remember the axis of evil and all that. Now it's Russia, China, India, Brazil, all these other countries that have been added to this list. Some of them much bigger than Iran as powers like China. So, and then the United States has enormous problems at home. The hatred towards the Israeli regime is growing, and even among young conservatives, it's growing. And the death of Charlie Kirk, not good news. It's not good news for the Israeli regime how things are playing out, how the FBI is trying to lie and to cover up the truth about the assassination. I don't know what happened. Obviously, I'm not claiming that the Israelis did it. I would, of course, the first place that I'd point my finger to would be Tel Aviv or the Zionist lobby, but I don't know. But the evidence that they've provided doesn't seem. It seems like they're covering. It's clear that they're covering things up. The the, the online exchange between the shooter, the alleged shooter, and his partner, the everything about it, the footage, everything. It's all very, very strange what we're seeing in the United States. So the United States has many internal problems. It has external problems. It has an growing economic problem. It has a huge political problem at home. So I think that when you put all that and of course the Israeli position in our region is not good at all. When you put that, I'll put all that together, Iran is in a very, very strong position today. Now, again, the West will say, no, Iran is isolated, Iran is weak. They've been saying that for 40 some years now.
The other aspect of what's going on with the case of the assassination of Charlie Kirk and what's going on in the United States is the Israeli propaganda or the Israeli support is diminishing drastically when it comes to the young people under the age of 30. And that's why they're trying so hard. They're trying to do everything to overtake, to just capture whatever Charlie Kirk was making. And they're trying to, to possess, to have the movement on their side. But it doesn't seem that would happen for Israel. They don't understand the depth of what has happened to the picture of Israel, to the way that people are thinking of Israel, with the case of Gaza, with the case of the Middle East, Palestine, West Bank, name it, in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon.
Yes, and also when we look at the situation inside the United States, we see, you know, Nima, the United States, in my opinion, its last two tools. I think I've said this quite often. Its last two tools for uh, for maintaining its hegemony were, well, three tools, let's say. But usually I speak of two. One is the military, which we'll leave that out. But the two tools that I have in mind, one is the notion of human rights, which is, it's always been fake, but a lot of people believed it. They had the media and all that. and the Western media created this facade, and a lot of people, young Iranian students of mine, believed it. Many of them, and that they supported freedom. Gaza destroyed that. Gaza demolished this notion of human rights and human dignity. Demolished. The second was the notion of freedom in the United States, and that's been demolished too. What happened at universities, more recently, what happened to Jimmy Kimmel, regardless of, I mean, I don't care for him or his show and I don't watch it, but the way he was shut down, the fact that that in the United States, freedom of speech is narrowing down. People who speak out against the Israeli regime get into trouble. Now we see TikTok is going to fall into the hands of the Israelis. We see CBS, and everything is becoming, it's becoming increasingly openly controlled. Charlie Kirk's funeral, I hear, is going to be like a state funeral where the president speaks, the vice president speaks, ministers speak. It's sort of like they're trying to take full control and make sure no one says anything that's beyond acceptable boundaries. That facade of freedom of speech is gone too. That facade of freedom in the United States is gone. We see a president who's weak and cowardly and obviously controlled by the Israeli regime, whether he's afraid of being assassinated or whether he's afraid that something is in the files that will show that he's had relationships that are illegal or whatever the reasons. I don't know. I don't know what's in these files. I don't claim to know. But the point is that obviously the United States is controlled by the Zionist lobby and the neocons, and they are sort of one and the same in many ways because the neocons are Zionists. But the United States no longer has the that the that image of freedom. It no longer has that image of supporting human rights. Its military capabilities have, I think, been uh, uh, shown to be inadequate as Iranian missiles struck Israel, as the Russians are winning in Ukraine, and after we saw the Chinese uh, parade in Beijing. I think that the United States is being weakened on all fronts, and people at home in the United States are obviously, many people at least who see through the propaganda, are coming to see this. So the United States has all of these problems across the region, and so does the Israeli regime, and you know their sidekicks in Europe. But they have growing problems at home as well. The United States is deeply divided, and we see their leaders as completely incompetent, killing people on boats in the Caribbean, no accountability. We see um, how they just lash out at different countries, threatening Afghanistan's, demanding a base in Afghanistan, and demanding the Venezuelans to obey by their obey and do what they want. This is not looking good for the United States, and it's clearly an indication that things are going downhill for them.
Professor Marandi, one of the things many people are asking us is the Samson option of the Israeli government. They're talking about the use of nuclear weapons maybe against Iran and other countries in the Middle East. But does Iran, with considering what has happened during the 12 days of war, does Iran really need nuclear weapons to defeat Israel? Or we've seen recently, 2 or 3 days ago, we've seen a new missile, the testing of a new missile in Iran. Or Iran is getting somewhere with the conventional weapons and missiles that they don't need to go to nuclear to defeat Israel, to go against Israel.
Well, one thing that I would like to say, now that you brought it up, is that I read somewhere online that this missile test was a failure. In fact, I can say with confidence, for whatever reason, that it was a huge success. And I don't want to go into details about the missile because I don't know a great deal about it. And if the more I speak about it, the more, the more I'm on thin ice. But it was apparently an important achievement, and it was highly successful. It wasn't successful, it was highly successful. Now, Iran today is far more prepared for war than it was a couple of months ago, for a host of reasons, which I think we discussed a bit before, and I've said elsewhere. But in any case, Iran is much more prepared today, and Iran can hit Israel very hard and repeatedly, and it can shake the foundations of the regime in a way in which they will not be able to control its borders. So Iran has huge capabilities, and they are spread across the country. It's not one base or two bases or five or 10. And the Israeli regime has shown its hand. Its conventional capabilities were used to their maximum. Iran's capabilities were not used to their maximum because the Iranians were not anticipating this sort of war. Iran thought that the Israeli regime would carry out some strikes here and there on the nuclear program, a few military installations, and that they'd fire some missiles back to hurt them, but they didn't think that this was the objective of the Americans and the Israelis were to bring down the state. A miscalculation, a major mistake, a fact that no one can deny. But in any case, which, by the way, paradoxically, ended up showing Iran's sheer power, showing that Iran is not dependent on individuals, that it is not a state where it depends on a leader or a commander or a host of commanders or leaders, that it is a state which has so much depth that no matter who you kill, who you murder, it will replace that person. Within hours, the response will come. But, as I said before, any threat made by the Israeli, the very fact, Nima, that you speak about the Samson option shows how immoral and rogue the Israeli regime and its supporters are. The very fact that you say this means, and the very fact that many people say this means that these people have no morality. They are pure evil, and of course we know they're pure evil. All you have to do is look at my Twitter feed, because most of my tweets are just about Gaza, just showing what they're doing to women and kids and slaughtering them and tearing their limbs off, and then continuing the slaughter and murdering people in their sleep and murdering people as they're just standing on destroyed, in among the rubble. They just love killing people. They love the slaughter. But they have no shame, no morality, no dignity, no honor, no humanity. But this just shows how evil they are. And that just shows how far the things have changed, that the world sees Zionism as so ugly and sinister that they would be willing to do anything. But Iran is a huge country, and Iran's capabilities are not known. And they're not known to the Israelis or the Americans. They say they are, but I think, without going into too much detail, that they do not know nearly as much as they pretend. It was clear from the way they carried out the war that they do not know all that much. I mean, knowing where certain people live is not really a great achievement. It's very clear where senior figures and generals live, where their families live, in any city, in any capital, and where you live in Brazil, in the capital where the generals live and the ministers live. None of them are hiding underground. But from here on, of course, Iran will take extra precaution. But the Israelis, they don't know many things. There are many things that they didn't know, and they will not know, and it will become more complicated for them in future, much more complicated. But in any case, they do not know what Iran's capabilities are. And if Iran, as I said, based on not my own comments, but based on what Dr. Larijani, the current head of the Supreme National Security Council, said last year, I think, and based on what Dr. Kharozi said twice at least, that if Iran sees an existential threat, then its nuclear posture would change. And Iran's capabilities, conventional and its nuclear capabilities, are known to everyone. Iran's nuclear capabilities, Iran's nuclear program is among the 10th of the top in the world. They've killed a handful of scientists, but most of them were managers. There are thousands of young scientists who work in the industry, in the field, and thousands of young officers who are prepared to defend the country with missiles and drones and whatever. So Iran's I would not underestimate Iran's capabilities, and Iran is not naive either. But in any case, if the Israeli regime seriously contemplating a nuclear weapon, countries across the world would see this as a national security threat for themselves. This is a red line. It would contaminate the whole region. It would contaminate oil and gas. It would cross the red line that would bring the world closer to complete destruction in future, when these red lines are just lines that should not be crossed. The Russians, the Chinese, everyone would be outraged, not at the usage of it, but just the threat of using it. So it would itself lead to the demise of the regime. I do not know what will happen in the future, but no one should imagine that Iran is naive and incapable. Iran knows very well what it's doing.
Donald Trump tweeted that if Afghanistan doesn't give Bagram Air Base back to those that built it, it's so amazing that those that built
He didn't build it. He didn't build it. It was built well before the United States invaded Afghanistan. I think it was the Russians that built it.
and
So should they give it back to the Russians?
yeah, it seems that what he's mentioning is that he's offering. But Professor Marandi, he said, he talked about this, and he said we want to take care of China. We want to have leverage over China, but it seems it's not just about China. It's going to be about Russia, Iran, China, even Pakistan, if that would be a problem for them.
India.
India.
It's about Asia. It's about the rise of Asia. The United States and NATO want to make Asia unstable. That is why Qatar, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman in recent years less so, and the Emirates less so in recent years. But why these countries were supporting ISIS and Al Qaeda, why they were supporting Wahhabism. Remember, the official religion of Qatar is Wahhabism, this takfiri cult. And that's why Erdogan has been training so many tens of thousands over the last 13, 14 years, probably over 100,000 takfiris in Turkey and Iraq and in Syria, with US support, with NATO support, with Israeli support. Because not only are they used against for the Israeli regime to destroy Syria, to destroy our region, to fragment the region, to enable Israeli domination, but also they can and will be used to destabilize Central Asia. The North-South corridor would be vulnerable. The Belt and Road Initiative would be vulnerable, and of course, South Asia would be vulnerable. And remember, ISIS attacks and Al Qaeda attacks, they're always taking place in our country. We saw how They've carried out attacks in Iran, killing 100 people, going to different places and slaughtering people. You don't see them doing that in Europe and the United States. Only on one or two occasions. They carry out mass slaughter in Russia. They murder Chinese engineers in Pakistan. They slaughter in Iraq. They slaughter in Syria. But they never attack Israel. Once during the Dirty War, when ISIS and Al Qaeda were being used near the Golan Heights, an ISIS troop, soldier, terrorist fired at the Israelis, and they apologized. They apologized to them. I mean, people can look it up. So there's no doubt that Bagram Air Base, it is not. They don't want it for Russia. They want it for Russia. They want it for China. They want it for Central Asia. They want it for India. They don't want India to become another power. They want weakness across Asia. They don't want Asia to rise. Look what they're doing to India now. First the tariffs, then the Chabahar sanctions. They're constantly trying to humiliate them. Now with the visa restrictions or the visa fees, which are effectively visa restrictions. So nothing should be viewed from, we shouldn't be naive. This is about preventing Asia from rising because the West is losing power, it's losing control, it's on the decline. And since it does not have the competence to strengthen itself and it continues to decline, it wants to bring down everyone else with it.
We've learned from Taliban they're not agreeing on what Donald Trump is asking for. And do you think that in the mind of those people in the United States that they can put a lot of pressure on them? I don't see that happening. I don't believe that. But how do you find the response of Taliban? How do you see the influence that the pressure that the United States can put on them?
Well, it would look horrible for the Taliban. They would begin to look like Syria. Right now, we see Shara has exposed himself as a tool, and his people are just tools. He is trying desperately to cut a deal. He's now going to Washington. He's going to New York. Al Qaeda after 9/11. It's we're still in September. Al Qaeda officially goes back to New York. That tells a lot about what the real story of 9/11 probably is. That itself, that the head of Al Qaeda, that one of the creators of ISIS, he's going to New York now. It's 2011, 2001, 24 years, in just 24 years. So 24 years in a few days. So if the Taliban moves in that direction, things in Afghanistan are not good. The situation is bad there. The country is in very difficult situation. Life is very horrible. It's horrible there for people. So if they were to show that sort of flexibility to the Americans, they would lose face in the eyes of their own people, but also they would lose any goodwill that they have in the region because the Iranians are working with them. They're doing trade and business. So is Pakistan. So is the Russia. So is China. So I mean, the Americans are far off. This is not the United States of 20, 30 years ago. So if they tilt towards the Americans, they are going to harm themselves much further, and they're going to be seen in a very different light. I don't think they're going to do that. I find it highly unlikely that they'll move in that direction. And I think the Americans should first and foremost focus on Greenland and the Panama Canal and take those first, and then they can start thinking about other countries.
Professor Marandi, with the visit of the head of national security of Iran, Ali Larijani, to Saudi Arabia, he talked with the officials there. and we had a new attitude on the part of Saudi Arabia together with Pakistan, a new alliance defense treaty between the two. One can defend the other if it was attacked. So Saudi Arabia, we've learned that they talk to Iranian officials what has happened during what's going on with the defense treaty between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. They were trying to clarify to the Iranian officials. And so, what is the state of the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Do you think I was talking with my guests, mostly in the West. They believe that the rapprochement that was between Saudi Arabia and Iran is getting better between Arab countries and Iranians. What's your take on that?
It is improving, but the problem is the United States. The Americans try desperately and with through threats to prevent countries in the region from moving towards rapprochement with Iran, or to prevent them from having closer economic ties with Iran. The United States is making life for ordinary people in Iraq very difficult by preventing them from using Iranian electricity or Iranian natural gas. The same is true in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. But the relationship is improving, and it is largely due to the behavior of the United States and the Israeli regime. After all, it was Saudi airspace that was used to strike Atab. It was extensively used. It wasn't just like a over a couple of kilometers. It was, you know, huge uh, violation of Saudi sovereignty, and humiliating as well. And nothing was. And the Saudis, they've been trying to shoot down Yemeni drones and missiles fired at Israel for for years now. So it's not as if they were uh, not they didn't have radar systems available, or they didn't have missile systems available. They have all these. They paid trillions of dollars to the United States over years, trillions of dollars over the last couple of last few decades, literally trillions of dollars, so that they could protect themselves. But they just flew over Saudi Arabia, the United States and the Israelis together, bombed. That's a good way to push Saudi Arabia closer to Iran, to Russia, to China, to Pakistan. So the relationship is improving, but again, what impedes it, and what has been impeding it for many years, is the United States.
Just to wrap up this session, I want to talk about the situation with the Palestinian state. And we've learned that the United Kingdom, together with Australia, Canada, they're going to recognize the state of Palestine. But don't you, when you look at Europe and other countries, Canada and Australia, and their behavior, where they can do something. With the case of Iran, they're doing nothing. They're doing nothing. In the case of Ukraine, they're doing nothing but the continuation of the conflict. But when it comes to Gaza, with all the support they gave to Israel so far, and they want to talk about the Palestinian state, what does that mean, in your opinion? Is that a political posture? It's just that.
Yes, it's only a political posture. None of these countries are going to take any steps willingly to bring about a Palestinian state. They are fine with ethnic cleansing. They are buying time for the Israeli regime. They continue to cooperate with it. They continue to give it intelligence. They continue to give it weapons to carry out the Holocaust. They are full partners in this Holocaust. They continue to be full partners. The British, the French, the Germans, and the others. They are full partners. There are no sanctions. They continue to provide aid. The main state media in these countries, or media affiliated to the state, they're all still continuing to try to justify the Israelis, to be apologetic for the regime across Europe. An MP who wears the flag of Palestine will be harassed in parliament and forced to change their clothes still after 2 years of genocide. So this is just political posturing. However, This is a sign of weakness. This is a sign that they recognize that their populations are outraged and their populations don't accept this. They are trying to appease the people, try to calm people down, uh, make them less angry, so that everything will remain as it is. So they give these concessions, this concession. It's not done willingly, it's done unwillingly in order to appease the people. But it's of absolute, it has no use. It's useless. Just a few Palestinians from the Palestinian Authority will have jobs in different European countries now. They'll occupy a building in, called an embassy in Paris and London or wherever. But again, this shows that the mood has changed, and we have to keep pushing, and people across the world have to keep pushing, and they have to bring down these regimes and bring to power people who will change their tone on Palestine and on human rights and on human dignity. Or they have to force these politicians or politicians in these parties to shift their position, or to remove some politicians and have others, younger people, come in who will change course for these countries. Because let's face it, the West has carried out this Holocaust. History will remember that the West, the collective West, intentionally carried out this Holocaust in front of the eyes of the world. This is not like any other genocide before. This is unique. The West has done something unique. They've carried out a Holocaust in front of the world, day in and day out, for 2 years, and it will continue. This is this shame will be remembered until the end of time. Such a thing has never happened before. That the entire world for 2 years witnessed in horror what the French and the British and the Germans and the Americans and the Italians and with the entire EU and the Canadians and the Australians and Erdogan and New Zealand and the Emirates and Jordan and Egypt and Morocco and whoever else, what they allowed to happen or what they facilitated or what they enabled or what they funded. Different entities played in different ways. This will never be forgotten. So people should not see this as, they should see this as a small victory that is symbolic of their resistance, but it should be recognized for what it is, having zero substance on the ground, but it should encourage them to push harder and to expand the influence of the resistance. And ultimately, I have no doubt that the Israeli regime, the Zionists, and their enablers, the neocons, they will fail.
Just before wrapping up, Professor Marandi, how do you find the situation with Hezbollah today? Sheikh Naim Qassem came out and tried to communicate with Saudi Arabia that the main enemy is Israel. They're trying to do everything to separate us. But how do you find it politically and militarily in Lebanon and in the region?
Nima, some people who are sick, who are sectarian, they're sectarian because they're influenced by oil and gas wealth, and they're irrational, and they're useless people who've never helped the Palestinian people. They've never done anything for Palestine or for their own people. They only insult others and they accuse others, whereas the problem is really themselves. So they attack Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a shining star in the resistance. They, for a year, for over a year, they fought the Israeli regime to draw off troops from Gaza. And they made huge sacrifices. The anniversary of the martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah is in 6 days. I was there when he was martyred, and people continued to fight. And then Sayyid Hashim Safieddin was martyred. And before that, just yesterday, the commanders were martyred. And before that, they had the attack using the pagers and so on. Hezbollah fought for Gaza in a very difficult situation. First of all, the events in Gaza took place without Hezbollah's knowledge. They were not prepared for October the 7th. Second of all, Lebanon is not Gaza. Gaza is controlled by Hamas and its allies, or at least its allies allow Hamas to control it. Yemen, in most of Yemen, except for the places where the mercenaries funded by Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and others, where they have some control, overwhelmingly the capital and is controlled by Ansarullah and its allies. Lebanon is not like that. Hezbollah is a group, and Lebanon is infiltrated. And it has many enemies. When Hezbollah was fighting, MPs in the Lebanese parliament were supporting the Israelis, calling for the destruction of Hezbollah. And these people could drive across Lebanon. They could go wherever they wanted in Lebanon. And a significant portion of the population was against the resistance. Some of them from the very same ideological, well, forget it. I don't want to go there. But some of these sectarian people, these very sectarian people, they're the people who they claim to be allies with in Lebanon. They were against the resistance. They were backstabbing the resistance. You had Sunnis with Hezbollah, you had Christians with Hezbollah, you had Druze with Hezbollah, but you had small amount of Shia, but significant number of Christians and Druze and Sunnis against the resistance as it was fighting. Like, I think according to a poll recently, the Sunnis in Lebanon are divided. The Christians are divided. The point is that Hezbollah did not control the government. They were a group. So while they were being stabbed in the back, they were fighting. And when they accepted the ceasefire, it was because Lebanon is, the Americans are influential, the Saudis are influential, Erdogan is influential, and they have ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria. They hadn't taken over yet, but they were there. So they were sacrificing themselves despite being surrounded. They could have done a deal. The Americans would have given them, they would have given them a lot if they just stayed out of this. And the same is true with Ansarullah. So they are heroic. And they made huge sacrifices. And the Israelis threw everything they had at them. Everything that they had at them. Hezbollah today is much stronger. And part of it is because they gradually rebuilt. They learned from the war. They learned from their mistakes, just like we learned from our mistakes here in Iran. They're being better equipped with new technology, but also the politics are changing. The attack on Qatar, the shift in policy. The Saudis were working very hard to undermine Hezbollah, but now after what the Israeli regime and the Americans did, I think the Saudis are rethinking. The situation today is better than it was a couple of weeks ago, so I'm told. And the United States and the Israelis continue to marginalize themselves. So the heroics of Hezbollah should never be forgotten. What they've done is absolutely unique. What they did was harder than what Ansarullah did because they were next door. They gave huge sacrifices, and they are preparing themselves, and that preparedness makes the Israeli regime cautious about focusing completely on the South. They continue to do that, but they're also threatened internally by American-funded militias, and they're threatened by ISIS and Al Qaeda, whose leader is now going to New York. Their position is very difficult. So, in 6 days from now, it's the anniversary of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. I think people should look at Hezbollah, in the coming days through that lens. Those who have, closed their eyes to reality, most people, their eyes are now open. But those who remain in that really, medieval mindset, they should rethink their, and what makes Hezbollah so unique. Why do they make these sacrifices? What is it in their worldview? What is there in the worldview, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, and Sayyid Hashim Safiuddin, and Sheikh Naim Qasim, and all these young people who are willing to make sacrifices, not just for their own people, but for some other people, or not even their neighbors, for children who are on hundreds of kilometers, I don't know how far away exactly Gaza is from the Lebanese borders, but people who are distant from them, geographically speaking. Why would they make these sacrifices? There's something about Hezbollah that we have to learn more about.
Thank you so much, Professor Marandi, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you very much for having me, Nima. It's always an honor.